Hi there, and welcome back to another episode in the podcast. We are at episode 29. Can you believe it? It has been quite a journey, and getting on track with the weekly podcast while I've returned to a full-time director position on a campus has been quite a wild journey. So thanks for your support and for letting me know that these have a direct impact or a latent impact on the work that you're doing, because that is ultimately my goal. And if you don't already know this, a secondary goal is so that you are hearing the stories of people that are also doing this work, and you know that you're not doing it alone. So those are the two ultimate goals. And if even one person is impacted by them, I feel like let's call that a small win to celebrate for the podcast. Some of the things that you can look forward to in this episode today with Julia R. Golden are about topics of self-care, being kind to ourselves, being careful with ourselves, and being patient with ourselves as we do this work. And I think even if we took each of those individually and focused on one today, we would find that we fumble and, we kind of trip over ourselves a bit, even trying to be patient with ourselves, being patient with other people. And if that was a theme for today, we would find that it is difficult to integrate those lessons on some days versus other days. And so be careful and be kind with yourselves as you're doing this work. And I appreciate that she uplifted that as well. Julia talks about the work that she's moving forward, not only at the university where she's currently an assistant dean in Boston, but also across the nation through the Ubuntu Institute that she started a while back. So listen more for how to connect with that work and about the initiatives that she's moving forward. We talked about following our heart and trusting our gut in this work as we represent institutional roles and responsibilities and commitments where we're helping our institutions to know how to serve our communities better, more intentionally, and help celebrate them. So trusting our gut and following our heart are two of the things that are sticking out in the top of my mind as I left our amazing conversation with Julia. Then we close out by Julia providing some amazing resources, some that I love that there is consistency among some of the podcast guests, that the book Trauma Stewardship is something that we should be looking to as a resource as we move about this work within our various roles, and also provide some fantastic guidance as Julia looks into the rearview mirror at her career of over 11 years so far. And I think you're going to get a lot from that. So if you don't have a chance to listen to the full episode today, making sure that you bookmark that for your next commute or for your next venture through the podcast. Again, I just can't say thank you enough for all your support and for letting me know how the podcast impacts each of you. I would love to connect with you individually. You can reach me through our social media channels at Resilient Campus. You can also send me an email, saby@resilientcampus.com. I hope that you have a phenomenal day, an amazing week, and that your semester and your calendar era, whatever that is, that feels like a digestible chunk of time for you, is full of learning and growth. Thank you so much. Welcome to the Resilient Campus Podcast, amplifying the voices of college inclusion innovators. I'm your host, Sabby Labor, founder and CEO of Resilient Campus. Join me each week as I interview professionals on the front lines of campus and community movement building. For more information, please visit resilientcampus.com/podcast. This is episode number 29 of the Resilient Campus Podcast. Today we're speaking with Julia R. Golden. Julia R. Golden is the Assistant Dean of Diversity and Inclusion in Student Affairs at Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Science University in Boston, Massachusetts. Julia has worked in student affairs for 11 years in positions such as conduct, residential life, student activities, and diversity and multicultural affairs. Julia serves on the NASPA Region 1 Regional Advisory Board as the inaugural Diversity Initiatives Coordinator, as well as the NASPA Region 1 Conference Committee, and is the founder of the Ubuntu Institute for Student Affairs Professionals of Color. Julia studies at University of Massachusetts, Boston for the Doctor of Philosophy in Higher Education programs to study the impact of secondary traumatic stress on student affairs professionals of color and multicultural affairs. Wow, that is a lot that you're doing, Julia. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today. I know that you have a full schedule of important things to do, so thank you. How are
No, I
you?
appreciate it. Thank you.
Good. Well, and thanks for joining me on a Saturday. So, what folks don't know is that often the guests are carving any time that they can out of their schedule, whether it's on the evenings, uh, lunch hour, or on the weekends. So, thanks for taking your Saturday to talk with me and for the listeners as well. We appreciate you.
Gotta hustle and grind. That's what I
Gotta
say.
hustle and grind. Nice. And so, Julia, you and I know each other a little bit. Tell us
Mhm.
more about what we should know about you today. What would you like to share?
Absolutely. I always start with my identities. I think a lot of times this work of social justice is a personal passion and one that I think comes in when I reflect with where I'm coming from in my identities. So first, I would probably start with that I'm a transracial adoptee. While I personally identify as being Honduran and Latinx, I was adopted at a very young age, at 6 months, to a white family. And so my parents would identify as Russian Jewish and Irish Catholic. And I think that that probably right there tells you a lot of how I view the world as being possible to really be one where dialogue can happen across any kind of identity. Not saying that it's easy, but saying that it is possible. I also identify as queer, and I think within that, it's been really important to, for me to recognize being a queer trans person of color, and now a scholar in a PhD doctoral program. That's been something that has been eye opening, humbling, and so far really rewarding. So those are some of the identities I think that I can start with.
That's awesome. That's quite a plethora of identities you provided for us today. And what I appreciate about knowing those identities and that you shared today is that you've not only made those visible for educational purposes, but it seems like you've made it your purpose and mission to develop communities, a sense of community for other people around those identities. So thank you for not only sharing them, but using them as a platform to bring us together when in spaces of higher education and outside these spaces. So
Thank you. Thank you.
thanks for your
Absolutely.
work. And are there any other salient identities that you'd like to share, or would you like to move into telling us about the work that you're doing today?
I mean, I think some of the other identities I would say is, I am someone who is really open to self reflection. And I think one of the things that I'm finally at a place in a personal level, but also professional level to talk about is and probably why my dissertation topic is coming from this is, I do believe that depression, anxiety are something that's part of my life. And I think that, the work that I do is a lot emotionally sometimes. And one of the reasons I talk about secondary traumatic stress and talk about self care so often is that I really want for people to understand you can be doing this work and have such passion in it, but understand that burnout can be something that you are facing, as well as knowing we're not all these resilient superheroes, that we're allowed to have moments where we fail, and not even just fail, but moments where we feel like, could I have done better? And I think the answer is always going to be like, we can always do better. And to be careful, but also kind to ourselves, because we often give our students and colleagues so much patience. And so I'm really working on telling others and sharing my story of saying, it's time to have patience and self care for ourselves as practitioners. And I think a lot of the work I do specifically with the Ubuntu Institute is to really relay that message to, professionals of color and also queer professionals of, you know, we are allowed to look out for ourselves and know that our story is not something anyone just deserves, that it's in our time and place to decide when we decide to tell those stories, and make sure that institutions don't take advantage of our stories either. That it's not a branding. these things are me. And so I think that those are some of the messages I'm really trying to develop in this next year. They're not easy, and it's a lot of self-reflection where I've had to dig deep. Um, but I'm proud to finally kind of share some of those things.
That's amazing. Yeah. And a lot of what you just shared is they are themes that people are sort of battling with in their daily work in higher ed. So I appreciate that you're, even using your dissertation work for the good of our communities, right? The informing how stress, traumatic stress, like how that impacts our experiences. So awesome. Just another layer of awesome that I know you're bringing to the world. So tell us about those initiatives, the projects, topics, issues. Like what's on your mind in terms of work that you're moving forward in student affairs and higher education environments today?
Absolutely. I think it's important to recognize a lot of times we have these things that we're starting initiatives on campuses. I want to give a shout out to Claire Katie, who I've done some work with in NASPA. And we had met during when I was a national co-chair for the NASPA GSKC, or Gender Sexuality Knowledge Community. And they were working with WISA. And, one of the things that really came to my knowledge is learning about the need for food pantries and for more resources for students with financial insecurities. And I'm still thinking about how I use that word insecurity, because I think for some students that is in itself a triggering word. You can go through a hard time and be like, well, I'm not necessarily insecure. What does that language mean? But recently, in this past, I'd say 6 to 8 months, I've been developing not only a food pantry for my campus, but also developing resources around it of what are the local resources in Boston, but also I overlook 3 campuses. So I have to think about Boston, Massachusetts, Worcester, Massachusetts, and then Manchester, New Hampshire. So it's making sure that all 3 campuses are getting those resources. But also, and this is you can create any initiative you want, but if there is not community education on why this resource is needed and on why it's important to know these statistics of what your students are facing, those initiatives are not sustainable. And so I also will be using this fall to really go around to all my faculty and staff and teach them a little bit about the statistics we're facing, the various types of reports that I'm receiving as a dean from our students, and remind people that this is a national crisis, but also it wasn't until the Boston Globe stated, I believe in February, in an article where it talked about that this is not a 2-year college or community college issue or state school issue, that at elite institutions, and this is happening. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. But I think until people saw that article and realized this can happen anywhere, for us, that's what gave us that motivation to really realize it was time to create these resources as a community. My favorite part of this is working with the student leaders and teaching them about how to be inclusive, of saying, your friends can't go out to eat all the time with you. And, think about all the kind of pressures there is to buy the right clothes, whatever that means for you all. So I think it's been really nice to remind students that this is something that they can do to be self-aware. But also realize if they need that help that they can reach out. So there's a lot of layers to that, but that's been probably one of the harder projects I've started, because you have to realize that there's some things that there's a limitation as to how you can help maybe as an institution. But I'm glad that we are finally in a place that we can start offering some of the resources that have never been provided before. And I've had a chance to kind of consult with other institutions in the New England area and give them ideas of how I started all of these different processes. But that's probably my favorite project I'm working on now for my institution. As far as, work I'm doing professionally, I would say I'm on the 2nd year of working on the NASPA Region 1 Ubuntu Institute for Student Affairs Professionals of Color. And we have a whole bunch of new people who are our advocates. A lot of times these institutes have faculty members, but we like to call our folks advocates, because the folks that I have individually selected, they're not just maybe scholars or professionals. They are also all folks who give back to their various communities. So they're the folks who, they're, whether it's them going to church or whether it's them going to, that next march or going into making sure people are voting. These are folks who are on the ground doing that grassroots work. So to me, it's important to have advocates who not only know the best practices and know how to listen to people, but they're also the folks who are like, I already been creating community. And so that's been really fun to lead and hear all these different perspectives. And that's been the goal, is what voices have I not heard and now need to include.
That's awesome. And I think even before I knew about you and your work, I had heard about the Institute, and when people connected your name to it for me, I was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. That totally makes sense. So thanks for your work there. I know that when we think about spaces for folks of color in the field, there are few. And so that's something that is really important that you establish, that I hope carries on long term as well. And whether it's you carrying that baton or, because sometimes it's like, we got to pass that baton on, and we know when that is. And I think that allows us to sustain the work. But it really is quite revolutionary that you created that space and that people are thinking about those identities in our field.
I will say this, and I think this is something that out of self-reflection, that sometimes I write things or say things or do things, and it's because in my heart it's the right thing to do. I don't always recognize that it, like you mentioned, something being as relevant or revolutionary, or just a needed resource. And I think that has been something, the response to this institute is so humbling. But more than that, I think I'm glad that I trust my gut. And I think that's something I really want our folks in student affairs, or just even if you're doing this type of work, trust your gut, because you know what your community needs. And there are a lot of people telling me this is a big idea, and is it really something you can accomplish? And I knew I had some ideas and an outline, but I also allowed my community to fill in the rest of that idea with me. So trust your gut, but also know that you have people who your people are, and know that they're going to help you kind of have that idea come to fruition.
I love that. That's great. It sounds like you're connecting like intuition with personal experience within your communities. Awesome. So you told us a little bit about the work that you're doing today, what issues and needs are at the top of your mind, and how you're moving those forward. How would you say you arrived to the work that you're doing today, or what is the path and the passions that have drawn you here today? Tell us that story.
Sure. I was thinking about how I really did not like going to school as a kid. I remember just thinking it was so boring and being like, can I just learn what I want to learn? Like, why do I have to learn all these things about math? It's fine. But I just think that for me, education was super hard because I never saw teachers that looked like me. I grew up in like a 94% white neighborhood that was, upper middle class, upper middle class. And I just remember thinking, like, I don't relate to anyone here. And none of the content we were learning was about my history or where I was coming from. And I really resented that. And I think the good news is I was a smart enough kid to know, okay, then I have to teach these things myself. And I remember going to the library and reading books about Malcolm X or poems about Langston Hughes, and going on my own and thinking about, who is Julia Alvarez. And, I wanted to know more. And so I'm glad that I was able to teach myself those things. But I think that, it got to a point when I got to college and I was just like, this is the time. I'm not only going to come out, I'm going to just be more about who I am. And I was really lucky enough to find a mentor who saw that I had a powerful voice, but also knew she needed to work with me on thinking about when to use that voice. I think that it was awesome to have a mentor say, you can really lead people, but also make sure you're listening to people. And in some ways would check me a little bit, because once I got to be a student leader, I definitely started to develop some kind of ego. My grades went from like, I don't know, C's to A's. And suddenly I was like, I got this. And I needed someone to be able to say like, yeah, you do, but also make sure you keep room for other people. And that lesson always stayed with me. And so, she told me about student affairs because I was like, I want your job one day. And she was assistant dean at UMass Dartmouth in conduct. And I remember thinking like, I want to be you when I grow up. And it's funny because now I'm an assistant dean, and not of conduct, but, basically doing the same kind of work. And I had this moment. I was at a conduct conference, and I heard that this was a master's program you could get into. And it's like something in my life told me, this is your calling. And your job is to make sure that, specifically at the time, LGBTQ students would never feel as alone as I had as growing up. And that students of color would always see me as being the representation that they maybe needed, because I remember thinking I really could have benefit from that growing up. So often, even when I'm walking in the halls now at MCPHS University, I've had students just come up to me because there's something they see in me and they just want to talk and say hi. To me, yes, the policy work I do is something I'm extremely proud of. The research I do, the new initiatives, the programming, it's all great. But the biggest thing I think I do sometimes is just being me and letting students know that means that they can be them. So I think that's how I arrived at this work. And I think it's been such a privilege to be my authentic self. Not everyone has that privilege at their job and in their life. And so I try really hard to remind myself that that's something that I should be really proud of, but I should also share that kind of message with people. Absolutely.
Nice. I love that. I've noticed that there's, given the visibility of some of the identities that I know I hold and express on the campuses and in the organizations, like people are drawn to knowing our story about how we arrived to these different areas of work, and it's like such a privilege to, I don't know, there are moments that are so beautiful and you can't really capture them any other way other than saying like, did that just happen? That was so amazing. And just trying to bottle it up.
Something as simple as I had a student of color, and she was they were having a really hard time, and saw me in the hallway. And sometimes you have students who kind of just look at you like, oh, how did you get here? And they literally just look at you as if they're amazed. And they offered a simple fist bump. And I was like, okay, I got you. And you could just see it, like it was like something lit up their eyes of like, I didn't expect to be able to have this kind of moment with, someone as a staff member at the school. And, I'm in a professional based science school. So there's not a lot of those moments where students can just be themselves like that. So something as simple as that, it really can make a difference in a student's life and feeling like they're connected to the institution.
Julia, so you've mentioned some of the different areas that you do work in and around your identities and just being. Where can you just be yourself?
Sure. So I moved to Boston back in 2010. I'd been coming from Western Mass, and I really just wanted kind of a city life because I thought I really want to meet lots of people and create community for myself. And I actually did that out of almost self-care for myself of let's get back in a city. And I had met a bunch of queer women of color in a social group, and that was provided by the Hispanic Black Gay Coalition in Boston. And it was called Sister Circle, and it was really just a chance for people to talk about their work week, talk about their life. There were moments where we just kind of celebrated and enjoyed each other, but there's also moments where we're like, wow, we're in it today and let's just talk this out. So I think that was one of the most beautiful spaces I've ever been a part of in Boston. I think it's also finding places through some of the people I've met throughout NASPA. Those are not just colleagues. There are a lot of folks who I actually consider more like brothers and sisters or best friends. And so it's funny how NASPA may have brought us together, but we realized it was our passion for higher education and student affairs work that we really related to. So something as simple as creating a group me chat was something that, we just, whether it's about, I need to talk about this right now, I had this kind of day, or, just laugh about something with like a silly meme. I think that's always really fun. And I've created those kind of group me and, I chats with lots of different people around the nation just because there's something about the fact that social media and technology brings people together in a way that, you don't have to be, in the same place. You can have each other and talk to each other and connect with each other at some more convenient time. But it's just, we all have the same things going on in our life. So it's always nice to just be like, let's just check in. Let's talk about what's going on. And also, what I've really loved about having kind of a bicoastal connection with people and network is that there are things happening in California that we haven't even tried to do on the East Coast and vice versa. So even things with Ubuntu, there were things with, originally I had started this mostly for my Black and queer and trans people of color colleagues. They were the ones who were being, I felt like, targeted the most in our field. And I knew there was a lot of opportunities for Latinx individuals already. But then I started hearing about some of the things going on for the PETA community. And I thought, oh, we need to start that work here in the East before it gets ahead of itself. And we need to make sure we're supporting those voices. And so I think when I think about finding community, it's been really intentional that I talk with people who are not already with me doing the work, but people who are ahead of me and saying, have you considered this idea or this topic that's come up? Have you even started the research on this new thing? And I'm like, well, no, I haven't. And so I love surrounding myself with people who are motivated and forward thinking and think big picture. And I'm so lucky that I found that in my communities and that I have a network that's national so that people know that when they tell me an idea that I'm like really curious and then I'm going to be like, well, what can we do? So I think that's been really cool to meet people who are also go-getters around the nation.
That's cool. I love hearing that because I think, and is one of your top strengths a connector at all or a maximizer?
I mean, I'm a woo. That should not surprise anyone. I'm sure connector as well. But yeah, you know what? I think, what was it? There was one that I really thought was, I think I can't remember the name, but it's basically you can look at individuals, maybe idealization. You can look at each individual and understand how to work with them. But then for me, it's about how do you connect people in a big picture. I'm like, hey, this person in Boston and this person in Philly and that person in Oakland, California, did y'all know you're doing the same work? Like, let's talk about that. That to me is my favorite moment is when you're introducing people and they're all like, what? We're all doing this?
Yeah.
I don't know. Especially as for me as a queer trans person of color, like, oh, it's brilliant when you're just like, I'm not alone in this. We've been doing this work. Rebecca Comage, one of my former bosses, said something to me that I just love this quote. It's, we are not new to this. We are true to this. And I have carried that quote with me everywhere because it always reminds me that, none of this work that we're doing is new, is that we have managed to create these voices and stories because we're true to them and that we understand them. And I think it's always awesome when you realize that so many of you share similar stories. They're different, but they're similar.
Yeah, I love that. And I met Rebecca recently, and what a cool human being. Like, seriously.
Shout out to Rebecca.
Amazing. Rebecca, I hope you listen to this and, like, just know that we're admiring you.
She's also an advocate for the Ubuntu Institute. Just saying, how to give her a plug.
Nice. Great work. Thanks for your work there too, Rebecca. So you've talked about some words that have inspired your work. Share some of those resources, whether they're books or podcasts, bodies of scholarship or work that inform the way that you approach the work that you're doing today.
Absolutely. When I was thinking about this theory of secondary traumatic stress, really that's used for people who are social workers or counselors. You are serving communities and in the work that you're doing, you're having to hear a lot of trauma and pain. But I do think a lot of folks who are doing the work in diversity and multicultural affairs are often receiving somewhat similar stories, and yet we are not given maybe a training or perhaps a way to really think about, am I okay to do this work? And how am I feeling about where I am with this work? And did I help the student and give them what they needed? But also, because that was maybe something that was upsetting to hear about, do I need to debrief? Do I need to consider, talking with a colleague about how that situation went? We know that counselors do that oftentimes, that they will talk with their fellow counselors and say, this is the a client I'm seeing, and let's talk. So one book that I've really appreciated, Trauma Stewardship. This is something that when one of my students from Simmons was telling me, I was telling her about my dissertation, they were like saying that this is something that we needed to consider. Trauma stewardship is something that it allows you to consider, what does your self-care look like? And what can you do to help yourself when you are facing a lot of students coming to you and not maybe even having a moment to take that all in and think about what have what is it like to hold those stories for others. And so it's a really great guide that almost provides a self inventory. And I think that self inventory component is something I think I really want to highlight in my dissertation of, let's make sure that we're checking in with ourselves and thinking about where we're at so that we can continue this work and not burn out so easily. So that's one book I really appreciate. One other book that I really want to shout out is the AVP book. Now, this is probably a personal preference, but my big thing is, I think, especially in student affairs, and I'm saying this for new pros, probably maybe some mid-levels as well, is I really like reading about job positions and descriptions and understanding the future of where I want to go. So no, I'm not going to be an AVP probably anytime soon, but I really appreciated this book because it's the first of its kind, and I wanted to understand that role for the future, so that I can better prepare myself in the work I'm doing now. So I really appreciated that. And one of my good friends, Pauline Dabrowski, had a section in it that I really appreciated reading. The other book I just wanted to quickly mention it's going to be coming out later this year, Contested Issues in Troubled Times. I was asked to write a response to one of the chapters by Peter Magolda and Marsha Baxter Magolda. This book, I think, is going to have a lot of very relevant information and topics. And one of the pieces that I got to write about is how student affair professionals of color navigate social media, but knowing that a lot of times we have to be more careful because it can really impact our job and livelihood. And so that is something that I kind of write and talk about in my piece.
That's awesome. I love that. So there's something happening, Julia, in our field, and it's showing up on the podcast. So last episode, well, actually the last two episodes it came up. One because I brought it up in the previous episode, but then also on episode 27 with Erin Kate. Erin Kate was also mentioning the trauma stewardship book, and I think there's some connections that people like yourself are making in the field about our professional preparation programs potentially, or the ways in which we're preparing ourselves to deal with issues of trauma and oppression and harm, and being frontline folks and being folks that provide the support structurally, interpersonally, and how that interlaps, interconnects, intersects with our identities, and how personal that is. So there's something bubbling and building right now that I think that I'm so grateful that you're doing that work with your dissertation and writing about how we're navigating social media and how we have to do it more carefully than our other colleagues. And the stakes are higher, right? Like the stakes are often higher for us as really highly visible folks of multiple marginalized identities. And so I wonder how we're going to convene around this idea about how social workers and other folks in like mental health practitioner fields are being prepared to do this trauma-based work, and how to not burn out, and how we're seeing parallels in our field. So that's so interesting that it keeps coming up. I mean, I hope that people keep raising the questions.
Well, I think there's two parts of that. I mean, it's something as simple as how we treat our graduate students. We have grad students who haven't even finished programs, and we don't do a lot necessarily to provide them professional development. We just use them for jobs that we can't pay a professional to do. Like, let's be very real about what this is and what's happening. And I recognize I'm going to probably get backlash just for saying this, but I do believe that our higher education programs are at master's levels. Many don't have a diversity component to their program. I've been asked to speak at many diversity higher education programs, and I love that. I think that's amazing. But I often ask the facilitator and professor, I'm like, what other speakers are you bringing, and who are you bringing, and what topics? Because it can't just be you bring me and then you're fulfilled for the semester. It has to be multiple voices. I mean, I also always ask what voices aren't being brought up. I want more Indigenous voices. I want more undocumented voices. I want more APITA voices. And so I think that these are things that I want us to consider. But I've had friends say to me, as we bring folks to student affairs, um, it's kind of like what we do with college students. You can bring anyone you want here to this field, but are we retaining them? Are they actually able to persist and be okay within this field? I think, unfortunately, a lot of our people of color and queer folks are realizing that they're in this field because they believe that this work needs to be done and they have to represent something, but at what expense and what cost? And I think um, I definitely am hearing the amount of grief people feel like when they've lost their job because of who they are. The grief is so real and something that many of us will not talk about because we feel like we failed a job. No, that job failed you. And I think that that is something that we need to understand. Um, when you hire people of color, just be prepared that there might be other resources and connections that need to be provided. I recently had someone who went for a job interview and said, how would you be supporting this multicultural coordinator? And it was like a big question that they asked, and people weren't ready to even answer it. And I think right there, just be ready for those types of questions if you're an advocate to people of color and folks from marginalized identities. We deserve to go to work and show up and feel like our work will be taken seriously, but also that it's not taken advantage of either.
It's so interesting when I think about the possibilities of infusing that one diversity course, when I think about that model versus what the possibilities are for infusing social justice principles and ideas into every course, right?
Mhm.
Like, so if we're preparing our admissions and recruiter folks to have an intersectional understanding of recruiting people to a campus that may or may not be celebrating those identities and experiences, and how that's sort of this paradoxical situation, right? It's like, what is their responsibility in all the different functional areas, not just multicultural affairs? And so I think there's something about like some generations of leadership that are, whether they're faculty in our professional preparation programs, they're administrators, where we're hoping, I'm hoping, and I don't know if this is just me observing and dreaming and aspiring, but I'm hoping we're kind of seeing a new wave of folks that are maybe it's in smaller numbers than I know I'd like, but they're making their way into administrative roles, or they're making their way into teaching in the higher ed, professional preparation programs and whatnot, that have that social justice lens in everything they do. And it's not just the one diversity course.
One other thing I would say on the higher education institution component is how HR can work more efficiently to really provide support for our individuals. Because I think, something as simple as, I'm working with HR right now, like just to sponsor a women of color lunch and socials at my institution. That is very significant for the women who have that chance and opportunity to go to that lunch. It's just a moment for them to feel like, hey, we're all here to see each other, to talk about the good things that we're celebrating and excited to have in the semester, but also things that we're like, wow, we didn't expect this as a challenge or something. And so, I think it's something as simple as that. I was talking to folks and saying, let's think about how there are ways that we can provide professional development. Now, all of it is, workshops and this and that. It's sometimes just giving people a chance to just communicate, have community with one another. I don't know. I think there's something there as well, is how do you create that institutional change, not just expect that in grad school we'll learn a few things and then that's it. There's different pieces in HR that I think could really help in not only how they interview people and bring new candidates and where they look for them and market it, but I also think once that you have those folks working on your campus, how do you continue that support? And I've really enjoyed working with HR at a couple of campuses at this point.
Yeah, I mean, they're one of our biggest partners. I think when the topic you're bringing up about institutional change is HR has their hands in so many different components.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Cool. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I like to think of these last set of questions as kind of like looking in the rear view mirror. And in thinking about some of the biggest lessons that you've learned, I'd love for you to share some of those with the listeners, but also, what guidance or insights have you derived from those experiences to share out with people as well?
I think the biggest lesson I learned is that my story is mine alone, and that it is a privilege for anyone to be able to hear it. And I think pacing myself and how I like to work within my identities and share those with others is something that's really important. Had I shared about being a transracial adoptee even 10, 15 years ago, I wouldn't have been ready and I couldn't have honored my own story. So I think don't rush your identities. Even something like my gender queerness, it's not something I talk about a lot. And certainly I haven't really talked about it professionally. And a lot of folks get really irritated that I don't just say it more often. And truthfully, it's my own story. And when I'm ready to talk about it, I will. And so I offer that piece of advice of, people want you to show up and represent sometimes, but you won't do a good job in being able to do that unless you're comfortable and feeling that identity is supported and something that you fully understand. So take your time in getting to know yourself and thinking about what next barrier you want to overcome and with that identity and story. So I think that's something. Have patience for yourself, be kind to yourself. And when you're ready to talk about some of these identities, especially in diversity work, that will happen over time naturally. And when it does, I think as for me as a practitioner, I've appreciated it more. And but it's also made me more genuine. And so people realize that what I'm saying isn't just to say it, that they're like, well, this is coming from a place where you've had time to reflect and this is real. And I want people to see that genuine interaction.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I know people listening in are going to need to hear that. And I think part of it that I've experienced personally that I can speak to is going to campuses to speak. I've been able to practice and refine like which stories I feel ready to share in public, and it's been sort of on the forefront of my mind. But I also notice that as my disability shifts and changes, I think people want me to talk about my disability. And I've noticed that recently as it's become a little more visible, people are kind of like looking at my body a little differently, and they're getting a little distracted from maybe the topics that I am talking about.
Right.
And so it's interesting that how sort of people are wanting or at times needing us to tell a story for them, but then having the agency to say like, yeah, no, that's for me. That's mine. I'm either choosing not to talk about that right now, or that's just none of your business, right? Yeah. Or whatever the spectrum is in between. Like, I feel like that's not for us to share in this large group, or I choose to share that 101, or I choose not to share that at all outside of my family, in my household. So I appreciate you sharing that, because I think there's a pressure to just spill all when we're people doing work that is personal to our own identities and experiences.
Absolutely. And I will say this, I think a lot of times people know that a lot of way I lead is by storytelling and now especially as a doctoral student, then relating that back to theory. But at the end of the day, yes, I am someone that, especially one-on-one, if you came up to me, I'm sure we could share stories and get to know one another. But, there are a lot of parts of my life that, whether it's pain or whether it's just me still processing, I don't put everything out there as people might believe. And so, yeah, it's my choice to decide when I'm ready to talk about some of those things. Um, and I'm happy because I used to feel very pressured to always share. And now it's more of, no, my own time, it will come up, and that's good. And I think that's been actually really a lot of weight lifted off my shoulders.
That's cool. Thanks for sharing that insight that you've been reflecting on, and I hope that folks listening in have some points of reflection as well, and that you might feel a sense of relief almost to hear someone else say that you don't have to share all of your story or those parts of your story that feel. And I've heard some folks say like either they're just for you because they're personal, or I've heard folks also say that, speaking to times in your life or incidents that happened within your life that might be more of a wound than a scar at different periods, those are also those that, when you sort of get up to do trainings or facilitation or speaking or one-on-ones with people, it's like, yeah, how much of that is sort of processed enough that I have made a choice to either keep that for me or share that with others. So I hope that people have a range of responses to that, from like, wow, what a relief, thank you for saying that, to, yeah, that's me too, and I've made those decisions, and knowing that other folks need to hear it. Julia, I mean, we've talked about a lot here on the podcast today. Is there anything else on your mind as we close out our time together and we sort of move on from this episode?
I was sitting in one of my classes, a diversity and equity class, and I go to UMass Boston, and it's by Dr. Tara Parker, who is just an amazing professor. But we're having this discussion, and we're going around the room, and we're starting to realize just how much institutional racism is impacting some of the work that we do. And out of a group of 12 people, only 2 people are white and the rest are people of color, which is amazing. But we're sitting there and sharing stories, and we realize this is hitting us deep. Just talking about things that we've had to hold for our students and ourselves, and things that we've been told to assimilate to, professionalism and stuff. And I think that, there was this moment where it got really kind of dark in the room. And, I said, this might be me saying this to lighten things up. But I was like, I'd also like us to consider that even though that these things are heavy, and even though these things kind of hurt, especially right now as we're reflecting, that we do have the ability to create change on these campuses. And I talked a lot about the policy work I did and why that was the one part that really inspired me to keep going. And I saw people kind of look at me like, you're right. Like, there are things that keep us going and doing this work. So I think, I want people to consider what gets you to have a passion about this work, what motivates you, and what's that one story that you have for yourself that you're like, this is why I do this work. For me, I always have the term hustle and grind, and I have a poster literally across my desk, because when I'm having a moment of, I'm not sure I can do this, and I'm not sure, I'm doing so well right now, I see this poster and I'm like, that motivates me. And it also makes me remember that my resiliency, and I've been through tougher times or tougher things. And so just find out what motivates you, and always keep that in the back of your head, because these topics, they can be heavy, and that's okay. But also what's going to help you through those moments, I think, is just equally as important. So yeah.
That's amazing. Awesome, Julia. So as we close out, and I know folks are going to be interested in adding you to their network, what's the best way for them to do that?
Julia R. Golden on Twitter is probably the best place to follow me. I'm developing a website, so I'll have to give that at some other time. But I think Twitter is actually one of the best places to reach me at right now.
Okay.
And LinkedIn.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so what I'll do for folks is I will provide links to your LinkedIn profile, your Twitter, and then also to the books and resources that you mentioned earlier in our conversation so that they can easily have access to those. So Julia, thank you deeply for being with us today. I learned a lot. I'm reflecting on a lot, and I know that people listening in are going to learn so much. And so thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and so as with every episode, we wanted to close out with an inspirational quote to send you back out into the world, and Julia is going to provide that quote for us today.
Yep, this quote comes from, I had the chance to talk about a year of yes in student affairs at the NASPA National Conference, where I related the book of Shonda Rhimes and said that the more opportunities that I can lead with my authenticity and passion, and I keep saying yes, I'll bring other people to the table. I talked about that a lot, but I was also reminding people, specifically women of color, queer people, that you were not given a seat at the table, you earned that seat. So own that throne.
Nice. So I will provide a link to that YouTube video of Julia's talk. It was amazing. I was there. I was very inspired. So thank you. To all those listening in, thank you so much for all that you do. I truly appreciate you. Stay resilient. Are you looking for ways to support the Resilient Campus podcast and the work that we're doing to build and bridge campus social movements? Join our online Patreon community of other social justice educators like yourself to develop connections, get guidance and resources from other folks engaged in this work, and get access to bonus episodes and behind-the-scenes footage that is only available to our Patreon community members. For more information, visit patreon.com/Resilient Campus. That is patreon.com/Resilient Campus. Thanks so much for tuning in. Head on over to iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss out on a single episode.